Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this virtual session from Solar Power International. I'm Sean Gallagher from SEIA, where I'm the Vice President of State and Regulatory Affairs. SEIA, of course, is the National Solar Trade Association and one of the hosts of SPI. I lead our state policy work, where our team works in both state legislatures and state regulatory agencies to make and keep the world safe for solar and increasingly for storage. I also lead our federal administrative work at agencies including the Department of Energy, Interior, BLM, EPA, Treasury, and others. This session on land use is very timely. As we see more solar being developed and installed in more places, we are seeing more and a wider variety of land use conflicts. The Department of Energy's recent Solar Future study finds that solar and storage can deliver up to 45% of the nation's energy by 2035, using about 1/2% of the land in the lower 48 states. Our panelists today come from the West, the Northeast, the Midwest, and the Southeast, and they'll talk about issues that they're seeing and how to develop projects responsibly in each of these areas. We'll also talk about how to ensure that equity and environmental justice issues are considered in the siting and development process. Before I turn to our speakers, I encourage you to check out the land use resources on the SEIA website, which include fact sheets on solar and ag lands, a land lease guide, a best practices guide for community outreach, and model leases and PPAs. All that stuff can be found on the SEIA website. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. I'll just really tell you their names and who they're with, but I'll ask them to each to more fully introduce themselves and their organizations in their responses to our first question. And I want to remind you all to please ask your questions in the provided Zoom link or whatever it is. And we will get to those questions towards the end of the session. All right, so today we have Chris Carr. Chris is a partner in real estate development at Paul Hastings out in San Francisco. We have Tyler Kanczewski. Tyler's a Vice President of Marketing and Sustainability at Innovatus Solar in Indiana. We have Colette Pichon-Battle. Colette's the Executive Director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy in Louisiana. And we have Jessica Robertson. Jessica is the Director of Policy and Business Development in New England for Borrego Solar, and she works in the Northeast. So let's start with something broad. As I mentioned, you each work in a different region of the country. What are 2 or 3 of the top land use issues that you're seeing in your region? Let's start with that, and then we'll expand on that as we go through the session. And I'll start with Chris.
Thanks so much, Sean. Great to have this opportunity to present, even if only virtually. I was super excited to come to New Orleans, and hopefully we'll be able to do it next year. We're going to have a wide-ranging conversation and not put up PowerPoints. I made the mistake of probably not listening closely and put together a PowerPoint like neurotic lawyers tend to do. And so I understand that that's put up for people to look at afterwards if folks have any interest. But top 2 or 3 issues out here in the West, in California in particular, say most obviously climate change and its impacts. Don't need to tell you all, you see in the news every day, California burning, which has been going on for several years now, but also, and not unrelated, from a regulatory perspective, we're seeing an awful lot of protected species listing petitions being run, both at the federal level with Fish and Wildlife Service and at the state level, particularly with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, seeking to get species listed on the grounds that climate change is a threat to them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Second issue, very important out here in the West, public land states, is what I would call the BLM reset. Most obvious representation of that is the agency headquarters being relocated from Colorado back to DC, but there's a host of policy and operational aspects to that reset that are very important for our industry. And then third, of course, and last but not least, the very important enhancement of tribal consultation, both at the federal and state levels, as well as the intertwined environmental justice policies and increasing emphasis that we're seeing out here in the West and in California in particular.
Great, thank you, Chris. I think that gives us a lot to work with. Let's go next to Tyler.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Happy to be here virtually with you guys. So I'm at Innovative Solar. We're based in South Bend, Indiana. We do a lot of solar work, mostly in the Midwest and especially states like Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Illinois. And we do development and construction. But I'd say just basic environmental studies not being aligned is something that we deal with quite a bit, whether it's wetlands that weren't marked properly. So if you're going to build a very large solar project there, and like Chris mentioned, with climate change and more flooding happening, we have to be really on our game when it comes to potential wetlands, as well as like we're getting into more brownfield solar opportunities, and some of the same things there. Just some of the environmental studies from the past aren't always aligned, so you kind of have to go above and beyond to make sure you don't do anything incorrectly there with the site. And then just a basic one, finding suitable land close to a substation is always a big glaring one. So those come to the mind for today.
Great, thank you, Tyler. And let's turn next to Colette.
Thanks so much, Sean, and bonjour, y'all. Colette Pichon Battle calling in from South Louisiana today. Also grateful to be here with everyone. Sorry we missed y'all in South Louisiana. There's nothing we like more than making folks feel at home. But as many of you know, we're in the middle of a hurricane recovery and a COVID recovery. And so we ask you to keep sending good vibes this way. I'm calling you from the traditional lands of the Choctaw Nation, just on the North Shore of New Orleans. And one of the issues that we're seeing and most concerned about is actual relocation of communities due to sea level rise. This connects with massive shifts in population and therefore connects to issues of tribal sovereignty. And this is something that we see a lot of. Some of our largest tribes in South Louisiana are not federally recognized and don't necessarily have the ability to make their own decisions about what happens to them and how they keep culturally intact as we deal with the impacts of the climate crisis. Also, we're seeing lots of commercial and residential development in what we know is an increasing floodplain due to sea level rise. And so we're seeing folks really sort of take advantage of the market right now, knowing that in 10, 20, 15 years, these places are going to be taken by the sea and folks aren't being properly, made aware of what's coming. I would also just mention that we're seeing a privatization of public lands that we need for the protection from this new climate crisis. So just thinking about barrier islands and these sort of barrier lands that they actually bring down the speed of hurricane winds and the tide from tidal surges now being taken either by government or privatized investments. And then finally, I'll just say agricultural land use, not because agriculture isn't necessary and we need it, but because the runoff from agricultural land use right now is producing for us now some of the most polluted river water, including a dead zone that's the size of the state of Delaware at the foot of the Mississippi River. This is really important as we start thinking about climate crises that push people into subsistence eating. So if you think about a storm, how long grocery stores are down, how much people have to rely on natural resources to just feed themselves, things like the dead zone become a really big issue. So this is South Louisiana's got a lot to work on, and I'm looking forward to talking about some of this more and how renewable energy can really help us address some of these issues.
Great, thank you, Colette. And now let's turn to Jessica.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for having me. And I'm also disappointed we didn't get to actually come to New Orleans, but hope we will soon. So I work for Borrego, which is a solar and storage developer. I'm based in New England, but we're active in various parts of the country, doing mostly utility scale and sort of community solar scale projects. And so in New England, it's interesting because there's sort of a few different types of land use struggles based on which state you're in. And so just using Massachusetts and Maine as the states that I work in most often, Massachusetts, has the classic New England problems of really, really small parcels, really small municipalities that all have different zoning regulations and permitting processes. And so that is definitely a challenge. But we also have, rampant NIMBYism from, people who are accustomed to their view being a certain way and they don't want that to change. And then we also have a very organized conservation movement, which normally I'm fully on board with and really want to partner with in many, many ways. But there's sometimes a really black and white view of land use, and the idea of cutting down a single tree in order for solar becomes, a non-starter. So I think there's a need to have a little bit more of a nuanced conversation about costs and benefits. And I think, going back to the justice-centered siting theme of today's conversation, I think both of those two concerns or sources of pushback are, I think for many, many years, we've been putting our power plants in certain neighborhoods that are most often populated by people of color and low-income people. And so, lots of other people have been able to flip on the light switch and never think about where that's coming from. With renewable energy, we're really flipping that. And so it's a much more land-intensive form of energy, but it has many fewer actually directly harmful impacts for the people living near it. It's really more of the impacts are, visual, or they're just sort of change. And, there are other, there's other nuanced things that we can talk about today. But I think that we need to be upfront about that conversation and really acknowledge that, there certain communities have really borne the brunt of our energy system for a really long time. And it's time to, spread that burden around a little bit more broadly, and also at the same time recognize that it's a very different burden. And so it shouldn't hopefully be quite so big a deal as trying to locate a new coal plant. But so sorry, then just to go to Maine a little bit, in northern New England more generally, it's a slightly different situation because there's a lot more land, and land is a lot less expensive. And there's also a different relationship with the land in certain ways where, natural landscapes are thought of as working landscapes as well. And so there is a little bit more of a, people are more accustomed to the idea that just because, a whole huge area of land is covered in trees, that's not sort of also potentially a source of economic activity, or, that there are different ways to use the land that can still be appropriate and acceptable.
Super, thank you, Jessica. And I want to pick up on an issue that you mentioned and so did Chris, but I think it's probably, more sort of central to Colette's work. Colette, the Gulf Coast Center where you work is focused on the intersection of climate justice, migrant rights, land sovereignty, and economic opportunity for communities on the front lines of climate change. How does clean energy fit into your work, and what do solar project developers need to know in order to benefit rather than impact frontline communities?
Yeah, I love this question because it allows me to say thank you to the solar developers. From a Bayou girl who lives in a place with a lot of sunshine, we know that there's real opportunity here. And I think that gives us all something to be really excited about. But we've got to check the premise of all of these questions. And 16 years in the post-Katrina, 11 years in the post-BP Gulf have led us to a lot of really deep examinations of words. And the first word to examine that I hope everyone will take a moment to examine is the word clean. And what legally the definition of clean energy is, and how that legal definition that is often allowed in our federal contracts and in many private contracts allow for dirty energy. And so we have to be clear what we mean by clean. Solar, wind, yes, we definitely want this. nuclear, gas, these things that have low carbon emissions, but still poison the communities that Jessica just mentioned. That 80% of the time, the communities with that dirty, polluting energy system are Black. 100% of the time, those communities are poor. And this is why we have to define clean as what clean really is. Again, another reason why I'm excited about solar and why many people are excited about solar. But that requires us to add a word in front of solar or in front of renewable energy, which is a hyphenated word, justly sourced. What we know is that a lot of the manufactured pieces of this actual clean energy like solar is coming and sourced from places that is driving conflict. South America and Africa are just two continents that are seeing the conflict rise as the demand for the pieces of these manufactured solar pieces are being put together. So we need justly sourced renewable energy. And that's really where we want folks to start. And we need folks who are in this for the business part. I'm not mad at you, but if you're in it for the business part, we've got to make sure that we're doing it justice on the front end so that we get justice on the back end. I think there's another piece to really understand, which is, and I've seen many people make this argument. Colette, let's talk to the Black communities and poor communities around why solar will help them lower their energy bill. And that's great. It's true too, which makes it even better. But there's a bigger issue here, which is called the energy burden, right? So it's not just about how much you pay on your bill. It's about why is it do these Black cities mostly, the highest energy burden are in majority Black cities led by Black leadership. Why is it so much of people's income has to go toward their energy bill? That means there's a problem in the system. And so we can't just talk to people about lowering their energy bill. That's just touching the surface. We've got to actually talk to people about what the real problem is and have our solar businesses be a part of the advocacy that's already happening on the ground that is rooted in a fight for equal treatment, equality, especially around energy burden. I'll just mention that here in the Gulf South, especially after Ida and really pretty much after every hurricane, we take the opportunity to tell folks they need renewable energy from the sun because it is our best defense for sustainability. This is not about lowering your energy bill. This is about having a refrigerator to keep your medicine cold when all the lights are down. And this is an important piece of the conversation. How do we talk about solar and transitioning to solar and renewable as part of a climate resilience plan, not just part of a capital market? And I'll just end by saying the equity approach to all of this requires an acknowledgement that equity is not equality. We're not talking about giving people access at the same starting line. That's not where we are in this country. And we've got to be honest about it. We don't have to dwell in it. We don't have to sin in it, but we do have to be honest about it. An equity approach to solar is not good enough. I mean, an equality approach to solar is not good enough. We need an equity approach, and that requires our solar friends and advocates and business people to understand equity requires an acknowledgement of past harm. It requires repair of that harm. It requires that we have a transformation in a system. We can't just shift one group of people with a lot of money to another group of people with a lot of money and keep the economic oppression in this country. We've got to transform this. There's enough for everyone. And I am cheering for the businesses, to do good and do good. But we've got to remember that we need to see these shifts. We need to see this transformation as part of the solution going forward. So I offer that because I feel like the business of solar really can meet the movement around climate justice in a way that we never could before. And it's time for us to come together. I do think those conversations that Jessica mentioned are what we need. We're going to have some nuanced and possibly even uncomfortable conversations, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't commit to it, and it doesn't mean we can't do it.
Thank you so much. I want to come back to some of those issues a little bit later, but next I want to shift gears just a little bit and ask Tyler. Tyler, you develop projects in the Midwest where you are working with different kinds of communities, and primarily they're agricultural communities, I think. So I guess what I wanted to ask you is how important is gaining community acceptance in the regions where you develop to the success of a project? And what are some of the unique issues that farmers and other agricultural stakeholders raise when you go out to those communities?
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, it's a great question. Well, Jessica brought up some of the NIMBYism, the not in my backyard. And I think we probably deal with that more than some of the farmers being against solar development. Just people not being necessarily close to solar historically, so they don't want it in their view or in the peripheral. When they wake up in the morning and have a coffee, they don't want to stare at some big solar array because they were used to looking at farmland there or maybe some trees. So we get that. So a lot of times when we're working with a community or with a city, we'll do a town hall, or some community engagement. We'll try to get with, especially with the farmers as well. We sometimes work with like farmer management company or land management companies that work with farmers across the state, and they'll help us host sessions to do education, further education about solar and all the benefits. So I'd say that's a big area of focus for us is really that just strong communication with wherever we're working in, and the town halls have been really successful. And I think there is a little bit of uncertainty with some of the farm communities as well. They're potentially losing potential crops to now solar, so they're farming solar renewable energy instead of crops. And you can tell a lot of them are interested, but they're just they're a little bit insecure about the future. But the good thing is we're learning that you can do things like pollinator habitat with these solar arrays and actually improve the soil health and help with water management, for stormwater, things like that. Bring in habitat for birds, bees, and other species, and improve the soil health. So let's say 20, 25 years down the road, when you decommission that solar array, you can actually have better soil there and you can farm on it again. So the pollinator habitat movement is really gaining traction in the Midwest, and especially Indiana, where we're based. Actually, a county, Randolph County in Indiana, they did a solar energy ordinance that includes pollinator-friendly provision. So that was exciting for the state of Indiana, and more counties are doing that, I think, across the Midwest, and that's important work there. If we can do solar and also improve native habitat, going above and beyond in terms of sustainability and land stewardship, I think that's what it's all about. And at Innovatus, we're all about going above and beyond, not just doing solar and saying, we're a sustainable company because we're doing solar. It's about a more holistic approach, which includes, working with the communities, working with the habitat, and trying to improve our best practices, and then spread that to the industry as well, because we want the industry to grow and become more holistically sustainable together.
Super. Thank you, Tyler.
Jump in on that, actually. I want to bring it back to two things that Colette mentioned and tie it back together. I think, we also work with a lot of farmers in the Northeast, and it's a very different model typically. And so all of these things are connected, right? And so the dead zone that Colette was mentioning is because of industrial scale agriculture and the way that, our agricultural subsidies work in this country. And so we're deeply subsidizing one form of agriculture. And what that has meant is that smaller farmers, like in the Northeast, have a really, really hard time making it. And then to bring it back to one of the other things Colette said about resilience and food resilience, in particular, food systems, that when we've seen with COVID, a lot of supply chain disruptions, and obviously natural disasters cause these disruptions as well. And then it becomes so much more important to have local food systems and regional food systems so that you don't have to rely on these global supply chains. And so in a lot of cases in New England, having, we see a ton of farmers that are really struggling to like keep the business alive, and especially as they get older and like their kids don't want to take it on, it's really tough. But they can take a portion of their land, maybe not the most productive portion, and turn that into solar, and then the lease revenue from that solar is so important because it's the one stable income source that they have when their farm revenues can go all over the place. So that can really be the difference between staying in business as a farm or not. And so I think, this is one of those things where there's a lot of potential for symbiosis and things having multiple benefits. And there are, I think the industry is learning a lot more about how to do multiple things at once, whether it's pollinators or dual use systems where you can have active farming or grazing in and around the solar panels. I think we need to do a lot more of that, and all of the policy systems that we have to incentivize solar, but also, the ways we're incentivizing agriculture. All of these things need to get a new look. And I think we all, as part of the solar industry, have a responsibility to not just sort of go for the lowest hanging fruit and the easy solutions, but to figure out what's going to allow the industry to thrive long term. And in order to do that, it's got to have some of these multiple benefits.
Thank you. And I'll say, just following up on that a little bit, there are some modernization provisions in some of the bills that are in the Congress today that would provide more funding for conservation, for agriculture, more funding for innovative programs for agriculture. And we've been doing a little bit of work with the USDA to try to encourage them to think about solar as conservation, right? As Tyler said a few minutes ago, the land lays underutilized or unused for maybe a couple of decades, and then we do have an opportunity to improve soil health over that period of time. And if you can pay farmers to encourage them to go solar, that can also help change these structures. Jessica, I wanted to ask you a question about another sort of related question about New England, where you have a lot of forested land, and we've seen some conflict when developers want to use even a portion of forested land for a project. And how big an issue is that for you, and how are you working through that issue with communities?
Yeah, so that's definitely an issue that that has to date had a very different reception in different states. In Massachusetts, it's really been the most controversial of the states that I've worked in, and there have been studies that show that the carbon impact of installing more solar and replacing fossil fuels is significantly greater than a forest. And even especially if in harvesting that forest, you're using the wood for things that keep the carbon sequestered, like lumber that's going to be in a building for 50 or however many years. That's not, I love trees, so that's not my favorite argument to make. But I do think it's really important to, to think about these things a little bit more in a more nuanced way. And then there have been, in Massachusetts, the latest version of the SMART program, which is the distributed generation incentive program, came out with new land use requirements that are very, very strict. So there's two key provisions. One is, there's a bunch of things that hoops to jump through, but there are greenfield subtractors, which means that the incentive that you can receive is lower depending on whether you're using, what type of land you're using. And then they also have a habitat layer. So a lot of these things are actually both the agricultural and the habitat are done by GIS layers. So if your project falls within this GIS layer, then you're either have a much lower incentive or you're totally disqualified from developing that project within this incentive program. And I think, so my background is actually in land use planning. And so I'm all about GIS analysis, but it gets very tricky when you're regulating based on a GIS layer. Because what has ended up happening is that when you actually put all of these layers together, like 95% of Massachusetts is ineligible for solar development. So I think we're going to see, these new regulations just were enacted last year, and we're still seeing sort of the tail of the old program and the projects that are subject to the old regulations, like still coming through the pipeline. But I think we're really going to see a huge drop off in the pace of solar development in Massachusetts based on these new regulations. So I think as a former land use planner, I'm eager for some actual planning to go into these and not have these blanket prohibitions of like any type of any land that falls into these categories based on these very high level data collection systems is totally ineligible, and rather have a conversation that says, so the Baker administration put out a report last year that of different pathways for getting to a net zero in 2050. And the Baker administration is not a huge fan of ground mounted solar, to put it lightly, but in that report, they did say that, even if all of the pathways were very heavily dependent on offshore wind and importing Canadian hydropower, and pushing solar in the built environment, so on buildings and parking lots, et cetera. And even with all of those other things where they're like trying to push all the momentum, they still said we're going to need 60,000 acres of additional ground-mounted solar in order to decarbonize Massachusetts. So that's great. We have that benchmark now. And so in my opinion, we really need to be rolling up our sleeves and saying, okay, if we need to find 60,000 acres, like let's pull out some maps and let's figure out which areas are appropriate and prioritize, all forests are good, but some forests are more important than others for various reasons. And so like, let's actually have that conversation about not just yes or no, but like, what's the spectrum of more and less beneficial?
Yeah, I think that's a good transition to the West, where we see some sort of related issues. And Chris, in California and the West seem to have the impacts of climate change on full display with the droughts and the wildfires we've seen over the last few years. California and the West are also distinguished, as you noted earlier, by large amounts of public land. How do these characteristics influence the siting and development process? And I think one thing in particular we want you to talk a little bit about is, what are you seeing by way of enhanced tribal consultations and environmental justice imperatives in siting utility scale projects?
Sure. Thanks for that, Sean. There's an awful lot there. I realized I actually failed to introduce myself. I'm a partner at Paul Hastings, which is a large international law firm, offices around the country and in Europe and Asia as well. And I head up the Environment and Energy Group. I'm based in the San Francisco office and have been practicing energy natural resources law for about 25 years. After law school, worked at the Department of the Interior for a while before going into private practice. And my focus is on project development, solar, wind, battery energy storage, any other infrastructure, getting the local, state, federal permits, and then defending those project approvals against any litigation challenges from NIMBYs or certain environmental NGOs like Center for Biological Diversity that litigate a lot of species issues. And out here in California and the West, let me take the last piece first, again, not because it's last in importance. Indeed, the enhanced tribal consultation and EJ focus is really very strongly felt out here in the West and in California in particular. I just have in my hand here the environmental justice policy of the California State Lands Commission. And two of its key goals: support cleaner energy industry and advance climate equity, along the lines of what Colette was talking about. And California is a good example, and other states out here are doing it, of really leaning into the challenges and opportunities presented by climate change. Here you've got a state land management agency that is prioritizing the use of state lands for clean energy, in particular solar energy. We had a project for EDF renewables last year that needed a state lands commission lease for a solar project. And that went through an EJ screening process, initially at the most general level, looking in the area to see if there are any EJ communities that are impacted, but then tailoring the lands lease, and the commission was quite pleased to be breaking new ground with this, tailoring the land lease to minimize impacts on any such communities, while at the same time promoting clean energy, which, as you all know, is being driven by not just federal policies and incentives, but particularly out here in California, by just a raft of laws and regulations. Sort of twinned with that, I would say, is enhanced tribal consultation. You're all familiar with the federal Section 106 NHPA process. Out here in California, to use one example, its environmental review statute called the California Environmental Quality Act. It's a little NEPA statute, but it's really sort of NEPA on steroids. In 2015, it was amended to specifically bolster meaningful tribal consultation, and indeed created a new resource impact category, cultural tribal resources, that now need to be formally studied and analyzed as part of an environmental impact report. And there's a mandatory consultation process that goes along with that, where if tribes in an area have asked to be notified of projects from any CEQA lead agency, whether it's a local government, city, county, or one of the state agencies that regulate resources and land development, such as solar utility scale development, that as soon as the application for any project is complete, the lead agency has to provide notice to the tribe, give it an opportunity to request consultation. And that the draft environmental document can't even hit the street until tribal consultation has been completed. And so we've had a number of instances on projects in the last several years where that's made a real difference in project timelines. And what we've really seen is it's empowered the tribes in a way that they haven't been before, to have a say in what goes on around them. And the California state agencies, I'll take one example. So that's at the statutory level, CEQA, but at the policy level within the state agencies, to take the California Department of Fish and Wildlife as an example, it has its own tribal consultation policy. So you not only have the AB 52 tribal consultation program recently established in CEQA, but you've got the departments that, even apart from what CEQA requires, have their own tribal consultation policies. And they are pursuing those and implementing them with what I would say is zeal and rigor. So you really have at multiple levels an increasing involvement of the tribes in the fashioning the development of the land and resources around them, and that have historically been important to them. Just real quickly, Sean, to touch on the other aspects of your question, with the BLM, as I mentioned at the beginning, you've got the sort of symbolism of the agency relocating back from Colorado to Washington. But just to take an example there, as you all know, it's expensive to buy land, it's expensive to lease land, especially private land. In the West, those land prices make it especially important to have access to federal public lands to develop solar resources, which of course, at a utility scale, take up significant acreage. And so that federal state partnership that in some instances was riven in the prior administration, we're starting to see, particularly out here in California, the reset of that collaborative partnership. And it's particularly important in areas of collaborative conservation. I'll just give one example from a client's recent experience in the Southern California desert. 8-Minute Energy paid a lot of money to retire the grazing rights on BLM lands, 200,000 plus acres of it, so that those lands could be devoted to conservation and count as mitigation for solar projects they're developing. And BLM this summer saw fit to issue what's called a crossing permit to a rancher, say on the east side of the 200,000 acres of conservation lands to get to the west side. And of course, it's not a formal grazing permit, but as you know, if you're going to drive cattle across those lands, the cows are going to eat. And so we, along with NGOs, Center for Biological Diversity, Defenders, Sierra Club, appealed that administratively. 8-Minute also filed a separate appeal with the BLM administrative hearing process, and we prevailed on that, where the agency withdrew the permit. And now we're in a position where we're working with the state government and BLM, the two sovereigns, trying to get them together to negotiate what's called a durability agreement that will help BLM going forward to attend to not taking discretionary actions that undermine the conservation value of those lands.
Yeah, that's a great story to see that. It's a great story to see that the industry working together with the environmental groups to ensure that those mitigation provisions survive. I do want to get to at least a couple of the questions that our audience has given to us. And I'm going to ask, we've got a number of questions about NIMBYism and the sort of the concerns of communities and when they see project development. And the questions include, how do we solve for NIMBYism? And can things like community solar scale development help? Can developing on brownfields help with overcome NIMBYism? And can agrivoltaics, or using grazing or pollinators or other agricultural products on solar projects, help overcome these kinds of concerns from communities? And I'll open the floor.
I'll chime in and say that I think those types of projects absolutely can help, and community solar, part of the whole idea behind community solar is that people, you know, there's a big emotional and political value to people feeling like they have a stake in something. And so even if it's just a bill credit and it's not, you know, it's not an ownership stake, that still can change people's perspective. But I also think that we really need to, you know, this again, sort of coming from an urban planning background, this is a very similar problem that we see with other issues like affordable housing, where you can have sort of broad agreement at a really high policy level that we need a whole bunch more of something. But then the actual decision-making processes on a case-by-case basis of where does it go can be completely stymied by just a couple vocal people who show up at a meeting. And the way that we've organized all of these processes is that the actual sort of local permitting processes is that no one really shows up if they're in support of something. They're much more motivated to show up if they're opposing something. And so you end up having just, you know, the system is skewed to always hear the negative opinions, and it's sort of a reverse tragedy of the commons where the people that are going to benefit from this thing happening are not being heard in the room. And it's only the people that are opposed that are being heard. And so I think there's this, you know, we need to do a wholesale, I think, reevaluation of how we're making these types of decisions, because certain constituents are being overly incorporated into the process, and other constituents are being insufficiently incorporated into the process. And there's also a total disconnect between, you know, a statewide decarbonization goal and local permitting decisions that have the up or down vote on a particular project.
Colette, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I agree with much of that, and I'll just say, you know, the part of some people having more gravity and value than others in these decisions is really, it's really a question about our democracy. I'm not sure if this crowd is ready to go that broad with it, but that's, if we get to these underlying issues, we have many processes that are supposed to be rooted in democracy that are leaning toward those who have privilege and access and the ability to challenge power. And that means we have to come up with a new way of doing this. I just want to go back to what Chris said about the work they're doing with community groups. There's a role here, sometimes an intermediary one, sometimes a full partner, in ensuring that some of these conversations are just a lot more inclusive, so that you don't have to get people up in arms in order to get them to contribute to the solution. But I do want to say something about the NIMBYism and the opportunities around brownfields and environmental justice spaces. We have to be careful that finding the cheapest, most available land does not give to Black and brown and poor communities what privileged non-POC communities don't want, right? The truth is that these things benefit everybody, including the planet. So we need to scale this renewable energy up for that reason, not because those victims over there really need our help, but because the planet is in trouble and we need to shift our entire infrastructure. And to put the, I'm just listening to the conversation, right? We don't want to see it with our coffee in the morning. Let someone else see it with their coffee in the morning. Let's take advantage of these places that are already dirtied and use it there. Well, those places that are already dirtied are necessarily, part of a discriminatory process of siting in the first place. And so I'm not saying don't. I'm saying we have to have that nuanced conversation. I'm really agreeing with Jessica's words here. We have to have those kinds of conversations, and we have to shift this narrative around who's benefiting. Really, I think we got off to the wrong start about how much your bill could go down, even though that's true. I think the narrative of the benefit has to be a much more collective one around what the transformation required to address this climate crisis is really calling all of us to do, and to bear equally as much as possible.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that a little bit, and we haven't talked about it yet, but out here in California, organized labor has been very, very supportive and helpful at both a policy level and at a project specific level to advance California's clean energy initiatives. Just to give two quick examples. Over the last year, the Joshua tree, which is that sort of iconic cactus looking thing that was on the U2 album cover, was designated a candidate species by the California Fish and Game Commission. So under the California Endangered Species Law, it automatically gets the protections of a listed species. As you can imagine, that has presented a tremendous problem in the California desert for utility scale development. And we were able to work out with Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Fish and Game Commission an emergency regulation that authorized and allowed 15 utility scale solar PV projects in 2 desert counties to go forward. And that involved the bringing together not just CBD, Center for Biological Diversity, but also labor support, community support, and environmental justice community support as well to get that regulation through. And then I'll just say at the project specific level, as you all know, California has a housing crisis. It's due largely to the phenomenon and causes that Jessica identified. And as a practical matter, for projects to get the support they need and to provide the high paying jobs that are attractive to communities, it's usually viewed as a cost of doing business that you're going to sign a project labor agreement with 5 trades out here. And organized labor supports that, as you can imagine. So it's really a lesson of bringing all of the stakeholders together and pushing forward together.
Thank you, Chris. Tyler, we've got 30 seconds left if you'd like to add your thoughts.
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, sometimes solar can be hands off, it's behind a fence. Sometimes you got to put barbed wire even on top, So finding ways to get creative for community members to be more hands-on with the solar, whether it's a pavilion outside the array that has a kiosk or signage that is educational about what's going on, how much carbon it's offsetting, what type of habitat is there, things like that. Or maybe the community being able to log on and actually see what the system is producing, how much of the city's power or the community's power it's producing, and all the positive benefits that it's creating. So just getting solar to be more hands-on, because sometimes it's up on a roof or it's behind a fence, and a lot of people still need education on all those positive benefits.
Thank you, Tyler. And I want to thank all of our panelists this morning and thank our audience. If I could see the audience, I'd ask you to join me in giving our panelists a round of applause. I hope we can see you in person next year. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank
Bye now.
you.
Thanks.